Wheel bearings are simple, durable components, and they're also extremely important to the safe and smooth operation of your motorcycle. A worn wheel bearing will ruin your bike's handling, and if left unchecked, it can quickly deteriorate and collapse, at which point you are really in trouble. Luckily, inspecting and replacing your wheel bearings is pretty easy, and I'll show you how to do it in this episode of the Shop Manual. This episode of the Shop Manual is brought to you by Kershaw, my go-to unboxing knife and a tool I carry with me everywhere. Get 20% off your order at KershawKnives.com with discount code 23TSM20. The owner's manual for most street bikes is going to recommend checking your wheel bearings about every 7,500 miles. However, if you regularly ride off-road or in the rain, you're going to want to do it more often since dirt and water exposure can drastically reduce a bearing service life. You can do a quick and admittedly rudimentary bearing check with your motorcycle on its side stand. Just grab a fork leg at the front or the passenger grab handle at the rear with one hand and the top of the tire with the other, and then push and pull forcefully. If you hear any clicking or thudding or see any movement of the wheel relative to the axle, odds are one or both of your wheel bearings is shot. This simple push-pull test is only going to tell you if there's a major problem that requires immediate attention. For a more proactive inspection, your wheels need to come off the bike. And for that reason, I usually wait to do it until I'm changing tires, which tends to land around the same 7,500 mile mark as the manual service recommendation. With the wheel off the bike, go ahead and pop the spacer out of there and then spray some WD-40 or degreaser on a rag so that we can wipe the grime away from the seal to take a close look at it. If it is torn or cracked or looks like crap in any way, or if the wheel spacer just kind of falls out because it's not making good contact, those are all signs that your wheel seals are shot. And these need to be in good condition because they're your bearing's first line of defense against water and dirt. Next, stick your fingers in each wheel bearing and rotate it. It may have a little bit of drag, which is normal from the grease and the seals, but it should spin smoothly. Any play, any grittiness, any roughness whatsoever warrants replacement. And I can't emphasize this enough. There is no gray zone here. Wheel bearings operate at extremely tight tolerances and they rotate about 1 million times for every 1,000 miles ridden. So any small issue is going to spiral out of control pretty quickly. And this one bearing here does have a little bit of a hitch in it, which is why I want to replace it and why we're making this video. To replace your wheel bearings, you're going to need to gather some tools and supplies. You'll need a heavy hammer, a long drift or a steel rod, a bearing driver kit or a socket of the appropriate size, a freezer and/or a propane torch or heat gun, a flat blade screwdriver, snap ring pliers if needed, some blocks of wood, grease, new wheel bearings and seals for your bike, and some safety glasses for you. First up, support the wheel on wooden blocks to protect the rim and rotor. And yes, you can set it right on the disc. It is not going to bend it, I promise you. Then take your screwdriver and gently pry out the seals, being careful not to gouge the edge of the hub. They usually pop out just like that. However, if you get a stubborn seal, you can hit it with some heat. That should soften it and make it easy to remove. Next, clean behind the seals and check for snap rings. Some bikes use them to secure one or sometimes both of the bearings, and those snap rings need to come out before the bearings can. To drive the old bearings out, we are going to be hitting the inner bearing race with our drift. And it's critical that your rod or drift has a good flat face on it so it doesn't slip off the edge of the bearing. So if it's worn or rounded, clean up the end with a grinder or a file. If you take a look inside the hub, you can't see the bearing race that we're trying to hit, and that's because there is a spacer between the two bearings, and we need to move that sucker over so we can expose some of the bearing race. Now, sometimes it'll be a little loose and you can shift it with your finger, but more often than not, you're gonna have to leverage it out of the way with your drift. Once you've shifted that spacer over, you're technically ready to start driving the bearing out. However, it's a really good idea to heat up the hub to about 150 or 175 degrees Fahrenheit by feathering it for 45 to 60 seconds with a propane torch or cooking it for several minutes with a heat gun. Thoroughly heat whichever bearing you're going to drive out first. This step isn't mandatory, but it is highly recommended since it's going to make the aluminum expand, which makes the bearing a lot easier to remove, and it helps preserve the bearing bore in your hub. And no, you're not gonna damage the paint or the powder coat or the aluminum of your rim with the torch unless you linger way too long. So please, don't sweat it. Now take your drift and place it on that exposed edge of the bearing race and start tapping. But don't just whack on one side. You need to walk this bearing out squarely, so tap it gently on opposite sides until it and the spacer fall out. Then flip the wheel over and knock out the second bearing. This drift and hammer method works fine, and it's what I did for years, but eventually I upgraded to this Motion Pro bearing mover tool. It's got collets that fit right in the bearing so you can drive them out squarely, and the best part is you don't have to screw with moving over the spacer. If you've got more than one bike to maintain, or maybe you just really like refined tools, this is a smart buy. Now that I've got the suspect bearing out of the Versus, I kind of just want to pop the seals off with this razor blade and take a look inside of what we're looking at. Yeah, okay, so sure enough, that thing is fragged. The grease is all black. The bearing cage has disintegrated. If we compare it to the other bearing, which has the same 40,000 miles on it, the grease is clean, the race is intact. Just goes to show how important it is to do a tactile inspection of your bearings when you've got the wheels off the bike, because you would not have noticed any problem if you just rotated the wheel on a stand or if you had done the push-pull tests. All right, new bearing time. And if you're replacing your wheel bearings, you should also replace your wheel seals as a matter of course. You can get OEM parts individually, or you can buy a complete seal and bearing kit from a company like All Balls or Pivot Works. I'll put a link to those products as well as the special tools we've been using in the description below. Okay, so take your new bearings and stick them in the freezer for a couple hours. Honestly, cooling them is going to cause them to contract a couple 10,000ths of an inch, and that will make installing them in the hub a lot easier. You can also reheat your hub if you want, but what I usually do is pre-cool the bearings and then install them immediately after removing the old ones so the hub is still warm, if not hot. If your hub uses a circlip, install that bearing in the circlip first, but in any case, you're gonna wanna take your chilled bearing, set it squarely on the bore, and begin tapping it on the perimeter to get it started. You can drive your new bearings in using a hammer and a dedicated bearing driver, or you can use a socket of the appropriate diameter along with a hammer, or you could even make a press using a socket of the appropriate size along with some threaded rod. Whatever method you opt to use, it's important that you drive the bearing in squarely and only apply force to the outer race to avoid damaging it. For that reason, I really do prefer to use a dedicated bearing driver since it centers itself in the bearing and can't walk out of place. But again, this is a specialty tool and you don't really need it. It's just easy to use, and frankly, it reduces the risk of mistakes. Speaking of mistakes, if the bearing gets cocked in the hub bore and jams up, you're gonna wanna hit it on the high side until it's even again and then continue. You'll know the bearing has been driven all the way home because the tone will change once it's seated against the bottom of the bore. Now, take the wheel, flip it over, and install the spacer. I've forgotten to do this before and didn't realize it until the wheel was back on the bike, and I tightened the axle and the wheel wouldn't turn. That's because the spacer plays an important role. It provides a load path between the axle ends and the bearing races, so it has to be perfectly aligned with the inner bearing races. So make sure it is, and then as you're driving your second bearing home, just take a pause before it gets all the way to the bottom of the bore and make sure it is still perfectly aligned. There we go. With both bearings installed and that spacer sitting right where it belongs, it is time to install your fresh, new, tight wheel seals. Usually you can press these things in by hand, although it's perfectly acceptable to tap them into place with a hammer, and you want it to sit flush with the surface of the hub. And if those seal lips aren't already packed with grease, it is your responsibility to smear some on now. Wiping the grime off your wheel spacers and cleaning and re-greasing your wheel seals is something you should do anytime your wheels come off the bike. It'll help the seals do their job better, which means your wheel bearings will last longer. All right, with that, we have completed one wheel, which means we are halfway done because you should replace your front and rear wheel bearings as a set. Keep in mind, it'll be the same process for the rear wheel as it was for the front. And frankly, it's the same process whether you've got cast wheels or spoke wheels, whether you're on a vintage bike or a modern bike, or you're riding a scooter or a sport bike or an ADV. Now that you've watched this video, you know how to inspect and replace your wheel bearings. Thanks for watching this episode of the Shop Manual. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. And I gotta say, I enjoy it. It's a huge privilege to be able to teach people about motorcycles so they can understand them and work on them better. So if you like what we do here, you like the information we bring and the questions we answer, just know that the Shop Manual is produced with funds when people like you make a purchase at RevZilla. So if you want to support the Shop Manual, support RevZilla. And if you want more motorcycle content, you want written reviews and news, cruise on over to Common Tread, where we are constantly publishing new content.